Deep in the remote wilderness of Lincoln, Montana, surrounded by the towering silence of the national forest, stood a structure that was barely more than a shed. It measured 10 by 12 feet. It lacked electricity and running water. To a casual observer hiking through the woods, it might have appeared to be an abandoned outpost or a hunter's temporary shelter. But inside this unassuming plywood box lived a man who was orchestrating a campaign of terror that would paralyze a nation for nearly 2 decades. This was the home of Theodore Kaczynski, a former mathematics prodigy whose intellect had curdled into a violent hatred of modern technology and industrial society. For 17 years, the Federal Bureau of Investigation chased a ghost. They had no face, no name, and for the longest time, no clear motive. The suspect was known only by the code name Unabomber, derived from his early targets, universities and airlines. It became the most expensive and resource-intensive manhunt in American history. The investigation involved hundreds of agents, thousands of leads, and millions of dollars. Yet the breakthrough did not come from a fingerprint or a witness sighting. It came from words. It was a victory of linguistic forensics and the agonizing moral courage of a brother who recognized a familiar voice in the writings of a killer. This is the story of how the machinery of justice eventually caught up with the man who tried to destroy it. To understand the magnitude of this investigation, one must look back to the late 1970s, a time when the concept of domestic terrorism was radically different from what we understand today. The attacks began with a level of obscurity that baffled local law enforcement. In May 1978, a package was found in a parking lot at the University of Illinois at Chicago. It was addressed to a materials engineering professor at a different university but had been returned to the sender, a professor at Northwestern. However, the return address was a ruse. When a campus security officer opened the package, it detonated. The explosion was minor, resulting in a hand injury. But the mechanism itself was unusual. It was a primitive pipe bomb, handcrafted with match heads and carved wood. At the time, authorities viewed this as an isolated incident, perhaps a prank gone wrong or a personal vendetta. But 1 year later, another bomb appeared at Northwestern University, this time injuring a graduate student. The construction was similar, crude, yet strangely meticulous. The device contained common household items, making the components nearly impossible to trace. There were no serial numbers, no electronic timers bought from a store, and no chemical signatures that could lead back to a known supplier. The builder was making his own glue by melting down deer hooves. He was casting his own metal parts using melted scraps. This was not just a bomber. This was a craftsman of destruction who was methodically erasing his own footprint before he even stepped out of his cabin. The investigation took a darker turn in November 1979, when a bomb was placed in the cargo hold of American Airlines Flight 444, flying from Chicago to Washington, D.C. The device malfunctioned. Instead of exploding with catastrophic force, it ignited, filling the cabin with thick smoke and forcing an emergency landing. 12 passengers were treated for smoke inhalation. Had the device worked as intended, it would have likely destroyed the aircraft. This escalation brought the FBI into the fold. Targeting a commercial airliner was a federal crime, and the Bureau designated the case Unabomber. As the 1980s dawned, the attacks continued. But the profile of the suspect remained frustratingly elusive. The target seemed chosen at random: a flight executive, a computer science professor, a geneticist. The only connecting thread was their association with technology or modern industry. Investigators were dealing with a junk pile bomber. The debris collected from crime scenes consisted of wood scraps, lamp cords, and batteries stripped of their labels. But amidst the debris, agents found a peculiar signature. The bomber would often etch the initials FC onto metal components. Later, the perpetrator would claim this stood for Freedom Club, a fictitious group he invented to make his one-man war seem like a movement. For the forensic teams at the FBI laboratory in Washington, the case was a nightmare. Usually, a bomb tells a story. The sophistication of the wiring might point to military training. The type of explosive might point to a mining background. But Kaczynski's bombs were anti-tech devices used to fight technology. He used wood specifically, parts of the scutia tree and other scraps, as containment vessels. He avoided electronic triggers in favor of mechanical ones, using rubber bands and springs. This rendered the standard database of bomb components useless. The profile the FBI initially built described a blue-collar worker, perhaps an airline mechanic who had been laid off, someone with a grievance against corporations, but likely lacking higher education. This profile would prove to be one of the most significant missteps in the investigation. They were looking for a disgruntled mechanic, not a Harvard-educated mathematician. The first lethal turn in the campaign occurred in December 1985. A computer store owner in Sacramento, California, found a block of wood with nails protruding from it in his parking lot. When he picked it up, the device detonated, ending his life. This tragedy marked a shift in the urgency and the tone of the investigation. The Unabomber was no longer just a nuisance or a threat. He was a murderer. The FBI formed a multi-agency task force based in San Francisco, pooling resources from the ATF and the Postal Inspection Service. They analyzed millions of driver's license photos. They looked at lists of library patrons who checked out books on chemistry and electricity. They established a toll-free tip line that received thousands of calls, each one requiring a follow-up. In 1987, the investigation had its first and only potential visual lead. A witness in Salt Lake City saw a man in a hooded sweatshirt and aviator sunglasses placing a device in the parking lot of a computer store. The resulting composite sketched the man, with the hooded sweatshirt, mustache, and sunglasses, became one of the most iconic images in criminal history. It was plastered on post office walls across America. Yet, despite the ubiquity of the image, it was generic enough that it could have resembled thousands of men. The trail went cold again. For 6 years, from 1987 to 1993, the bomber went silent. The task force began to shrink. Some investigators theorized that the suspect had died, been incarcerated for another crime, or simply stopped. But Kaczynski had not stopped. He was merely refining his methods, making his devices more lethal, and preparing for the final phase of his plan. When the attacks resumed in 1993, the bombs were smaller, more powerful, and delivered through the mail with terrifying precision. 2 devastating attacks occurred in quick succession, targeting a geneticist and a computer scientist. The message was clear. The Unabomber was back, and his hatred for scientific progress had only deepened. The true turning point in the case did not come from physical evidence, but from the bomber's ego. In 1995, Kaczynski sent a 35,000-word manifesto titled Industrial Society and Its Future to major media outlets. He offered a deal. If the New York Times and the Washington Post published his paper in full, he would cease his bombing campaign. This presented an agonizing ethical dilemma for the publishers and the FBI. Does one negotiate with a terrorist? Does publishing the manifesto give him the platform he craves? FBI Director Louis Freeh and Attorney General Janet Reno made the controversial decision to recommend publication. Their reasoning was strategic. They believed that someone, somewhere, would recognize the writing style. The manifesto was a dense academic critique of the Industrial Revolution, arguing that technology destabilized society and restricted human freedom. It was written with the precision of a scholar, using specific phrasing and archaic terms. On the 19th of September 1995, the Washington Post published the manifesto as an 8-page supplement. Copies circulated across the country. In Schenectady, New York, a woman named Linda Patrick urged her husband to read it. She had long been suspicious of her brother-in-law, Ted. She knew he lived a hermit's life in Montana. She knew he held radical anti-technology views. And she knew he had a strained, volatile relationship with his family. Her husband, David Kaczynski, was reluctant. He loved his older brother. He remembered Ted as a brilliant but troubled man who had walked away from a promising career in academia to live in nature. But as David read the manifesto, A cold dread settled in his stomach. The tone, the philosophy, and the sentence structures felt hauntingly familiar. He went into his attic and retrieved old letters Ted had written to him years prior. The comparison was undeniable. The manifesto used the phrase, cool-headed logician, a term Ted had used in personal correspondence. It used the inversion of the common idiom, stating eat your cake and have it too, rather than have your cake and eat it too, a linguistic quirk specific to Ted. The philosophical arguments about over-socialization and leftist psychology mirrored the rants David had received in letters from the cabin. David Kaczynski faced a nightmare scenario. Turning in his brother could lead to Ted's execution. Staying silent could mean the death of more innocent people. In a display of profound moral fortitude, David contacted a private investigator, who then facilitated contact with the FBI. He provided the letters for analysis, hoping against hope that he was wrong. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit and linguistic experts went to work. This was a pioneering moment for forensic linguistics. They didn't just look for similar ideas, they looked for a linguistic fingerprint. They analyzed the frequency of certain words, the punctuation habits, and the unique grammatical structures. The match was nearly perfect. The probability that another person wrote the manifesto while sharing these exact idiosyncratic habits with Ted Kaczynski was virtually zero. The focus of the massive investigation suddenly narrowed to a single point on the map: Lincoln, Montana. Agents descended on the small town, posing as miners, lumberjacks, and tourists. They conducted surveillance on the cabin, confirming that a man matching the description lived there. They learned from locals that Ted the Hermit rode an old bicycle and lived without electricity, fitting the anti-tech profile perfectly. On the 3rd of April 1996, the FBI moved in. They needed to draw Kaczynski out of the cabin to avoid a siege or a booby trap. A forest ranger, accompanied by agents, approached the door and called out. When a disheveled Ted Kaczynski stepped out, he was immediately restrained. The longest manhunt in U.S. history was over. But the investigation was far from finished. The search of the cabin revealed a treasure trove of evidence that was devastating in its completeness. The 10 by 12-foot shack was essentially a bomb factory. Agents found bomb components, chemicals, and hand-drawn diagrams of the devices. They found the original typewriter used to write the manifesto, a match that was as good as a fingerprint in the eyes of the court. Most chillingly, they found a fully constructed bomb, ready to be mailed, and a detailed journal where Kaczynski had recorded his experiments and his crimes. He had written about the attacks not with remorse, but with clinical detachment, noting the success or failure of each detonation based on the damage inflicted. The legal proceedings that followed were complex. The evidence was overwhelming. There was no question of guilt. The battle was over the penalty. Kaczynski was charged with transportation, mailing, and use of bombs, and 3 counts of murder. The prosecutors sought the death penalty. Kaczynski's defense team, recognizing the hopelessness of contesting the facts, built their strategy around his mental state. They sought to portray him as suffering from paranoid schizophrenia. This strategy caused a rift between Kaczynski and his lawyers. Kaczynski vehemently rejected the idea that he was mentally ill. He viewed himself as a revolutionary, a political soldier fighting a war against a corrupt system. To him, being labeled insane would invalidate his manifesto and his life's work. He tried to fire his attorneys. He tried to represent himself. The courtroom drama centered on this conflict. A man fighting for the legitimacy of his ideas while his lawyers fought for his life. Ultimately, a plea agreement was reached. To avoid the death penalty and to avoid a trial where his mental health would be the central spectacle, Theodore Kaczynski pleaded guilty to all charges. On the 4th of May 1998, he was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms plus 30 years, without the possibility of parole. He was sent to ADX Florence, the federal Supermax prison in Colorado, known as the Alcatraz of the Rockies. The legacy of the Unabomber case is multifaceted. For the FBI, It was a lesson in the necessity of interagency cooperation and the value of non-traditional forensics like linguistics. It changed the way mail is screened and processed in the United States, ending the era of anonymity in shipping. But the most enduring legacy belongs to the victims and their families. Men like Hugh Scruton, Gilbert Murray, and Thomas Mosser, who were killed simply for doing their jobs. Academics like David Gelernter and Charles Epstein, who survived grievous injuries and refused to let fear silence their work. Their resilience stands in stark contrast to the isolation and destruction chosen by Kaczynski. The case also leaves us with a lingering question about the role of family in justice. David Kaczynski's decision to report his brother remains one of the most difficult and honorable acts in the history of American criminal justice. It serves as a reminder that sometimes the safety of the community requires personal sacrifices that are almost impossible to imagine. As we look back on the nearly 20-year reign of the Unabomber, we see a tragic collision of brilliance and madness. It is a stark reminder that intelligence without empathy can become a dangerous weapon, and that the tools of modern society, while powerful, are fragile in the face of determined hatred. The cabin in Montana is gone, removed, and stored as evidence. But the memory of the fear it generated remains a part of history, a testament to the time when a brother's recognition stopped a killer in his tracks. The Unabomber case stands as a definitive example of how patience, science, and the courage of ordinary citizens can dismantle even the most calculated campaigns of terror. It is a story not of the glorification of a killer, but of the relentless pursuit of truth. The investigation that spanned nearly 2 decades was not merely a chase. It was an evolution of criminal profiling. In the early years, the FBI was operating in the dark. The Behavioral Sciences Unit was still refining its methodologies. When they looked at the remnants of the early bombs, they saw a paradox. The devices were crude in appearance, wrapped in brown paper, contained in wooden boxes but sophisticated in design. Kaczynski had incorporated anti-handling mechanisms that would trigger the device if someone tried to open it the wrong way. This suggested a maker who was not only intelligent but also deeply patient. He wasn't looking for a quick explosion. He was looking for a guaranteed one. One of the most frustrating aspects for the agents was the geography. The attacks were spread out: Illinois, Utah, Tennessee, California, New Jersey. There seemed to be no home base. It wasn't until later that investigators realized the locations were often tied to bus routes. Kaczynski, refusing to use cars or airplanes, traveled by bus to mail his deadly packages from different cities, intentionally throwing law enforcement off his scent. This low-tech method of travel made him invisible to the growing surveillance state he despised. While the FBI was looking for flight records and rental cars, Kaczynski was sitting on a Greyhound bus with a bomb in his duffel bag, watching the American landscape roll by. The forensic breakthrough regarding the wood used in the bombs is worth noting for its detail. Agents analyzed the wood fragments found at the crime scenes and identified them not just as generic lumber, but often as specific types of trees found in the northwestern United States. However, Kaczynski was cunning. He sometimes used wood from other regions or scraps he had scavenged, further muddying the waters. It was a game of cat and mouse, where the mouse was meticulously sweeping away his tracks with a broom made of twigs. The psychological impact on the academic and scientific communities during this time cannot be overstated. For years, professors and researchers opened their mail with trembling hands. Security protocols at universities were overhauled. The free exchange of ideas, mailing papers, sharing research samples was suddenly fraught with mortal danger. Kaczynski attacked the very trust that allows scientific progress to happen. He wanted to freeze society in place by making the agents of progress afraid to work. Yet, despite the fear, the investigation persisted. The sheer volume of data managed by the Unabomber task force was staggering. Before the age of advanced digitized databases, agents were cross-referencing millions of records on paper and primitive computer systems. They tracked the purchase of batteries, the sales of specific types of nails, and the registries of typewriters. The realization that the typewriter was the key came late, but it was decisive. In the pre-digital age, every typewriter had a unique mechanical signature microscopic flaws in the metal of the keys that transferred to the paper. When agents found the typewriter in the cabin, they could scientifically prove that this specific machine produced the manifesto and the letters sent to victims. It was the ballistics of the literary world. The role of the media in this case was also unprecedented. The publication of the manifesto was a gamble that paid off, but it sparked a fierce debate about the responsibility of the press. By publishing the rantings of a terrorist, were they encouraging others? In this specific instance, the result justified the means. It proved that the solution to the case lay not in the physical evidence of the bombs, but in the intellectual evidence of the killer's mind. It required the public, specifically the killer's family, to become the final detectives. David Kaczynski's journey did not end with the tip-off. He lived with the weight of his decision for the rest of his life. He became an advocate against the death penalty and sought reconciliation with the victims' families, a rare and healing dynamic in the aftermath of such violence. His actions highlighted a profound truth. Justice is not just about police work. It is about the moral fabric of the community. When the agents finally entered the cabin, they were struck by the sensory experience of Kaczynski's life. The smell of wood smoke, the cramped darkness, the thousands of books stacked in tottering piles. It was a physical manifestation of his mind. Cluttered, isolated, and focused intensely on a single, destructive worldview. There were jars of chemicals next to jars of food. The line between his survival and his killing had blurred completely. He had lived there without electricity since 1971, stewing in his grievances, watching the world change from a distance, and deciding he had the right to punish it. The courtroom saga that followed the arrest served as a final dissection of Kaczynski's motives. The prosecutors were prepared to show the jury the devastating reality of the bombings, the shrapnel, the destroyed laboratories, the shattered lives. They wanted to strip away any romanticism about his philosophy and show him as a cold-blooded killer. Kaczynski, conversely, was terrified that a mental health defense would reduce him to a pitiable figure. He wanted to be tried as a political combatant. The plea deal was, in a sense, the system's final victory over him. It denied him the platform of a show trial. It locked him away in silence. The very thing he had sought in the woods, but now imposed upon him by the society he tried to dismantle. Today, the ADX Florence prison houses many of the world's most notorious criminals, but for years, Kaczynski was among its most studied inhabitants. He continued to write, maintaining correspondence with the outside world, but his ability to harm was neutralized. The Unabomber case remains a mandatory study for forensic profilers and domestic terrorism experts. It teaches that the most dangerous threats can come from the most unassuming places, that radicalization is a slow and quiet process, and that the most archaic methods can still disrupt a high-tech world. As we conclude this examination of the Unabomber investigation, we are left with the enduring image of the sketch, the hooded figure. For years, it represented a faceless fear. Now, it represents a solved puzzle. It reminds us that no matter how deep into the woods a fugitive runs, and no matter how carefully they cover their tracks, they cannot escape the connections that bind human beings together. In the end, it was a brother's love and a brother's sorrow that brought the Unabomber to justice. The case is closed, but the vigilance continues. The screening of packages, the analysis of threats, and the cooperation between agencies are the permanent scars left by Ted Kaczynski on the American system, but they are also the shields that have kept us safer in the years since. The silence of the Montana woods has returned to nature, but the lessons learned there echo in every forensic lab and police precinct in the country. Justice, it turns out, is the one thing that cannot be blown apart.